And welcome back to another episode of the Games Gone By podcast. As always, what do I normally say? I'm your host, and as always, joined by me. Okay, so I'm not always your host. I mean, I am always the host.
You are always the host, yeah.
Okay, sure, this is good.
Fourth time, the charm.
And welcome back to another episode of the Games Gone By podcast. I'm your host, Adam, and joining me today, as always, gaming amateur and enthusiast, Austin. How you doing, Austin?
Yes, it's me, the gaming amateur. I'm not good at any video games, so expert is maybe misleading.
So, first thing I want to address is that if you listen to our last episode, I said that the next one would be a game gone by. I didn't lie. This is a bonus episode.
Oh, okay. All right.
The one for February will still be a game that has gone by. This wasn't originally in the cards, but then we decided to make it. So here's your little bonus January episode. But rest assured, next month it will indeed be a game gone by. But today we're going to be talking about Atlus's latest strategic turn-based combat RPG set in a brand new universe, Metaphor ReFantazio, or ReFantazio.
I personally like the Italian interpretation of it.
There you go. The fact that maybe there's some like Roman allegory I missed, but like it could be.
It's just fantasy, but let's make it, fancy.
Yeah, so this game was made, correct me if I'm wrong here, by the Persona 5 team almost exactly, correct?
It feels like it. I know it's the same music composer, same director, same like lead devs. Like it's all the same. The core team is the same.
Excellent. And so for those that haven't played Persona, I would describe them as like anime kids in high school with powers. And the focus is usually on like developing your relationships, both with like, I guess the people in your party that you play directly, but also various followers around the high school or the town. And these all lead to various mechanics in which you're trying to, under a bit of a time crunch, get all of these things up so that you can fully explore both the like character stories and unlock all the gameplay mechanics. For the most part, that translates to this game, you would say.
Yeah, almost exactly, except I think this game does a little bit better of a job expanding some of those elements that don't work in Persona and removing some of the ones that people don't like. So this feels like a very tightened version of a Persona game. Like this game comes in around 82 hours, which most Persona games come in around 100 plus.
Good
so like
God.
So like really this is probably a streamlined version of most Persona games in a lot of ways. It's shorter. Like you have less time in the calendar system, right? You're progressing through days and doing different activities each day in both Persona and in Metaphor. But this game, Metaphor, has a condensed calendar, I think. There's only like 5 months versus Persona, which can go upwards of 7 or 8 sometimes.
Oh, I thought you were about to say 7 or 8 years.
No. That's crazy.
Yeah, so at its core, this game is still a JRPG, and it has JRPG combat, but I would certainly describe it as like heavily modified, heavily modern. They call it the press turn system, and essentially you have these little turn pips, right? And one per character. So if you have a party of 4, you have 4 turns you can make. But whenever you hit an enemy's weakness or score a critical hit, you only use half of a turn pip. And so the game really revolves around trying to like effectively and efficiently use the right moves in battle while balancing with, things that never give you another turn pip, so like healing, buffs, etc. And really striking that balance to where you get the most out of each round of combat, particularly because it's one of those games where like if you win without getting hit, you get bonus stuff, right? So it's the mechanics really just force you to like interact with the JRPG combat system in a way that isn't just let me spam my most powerful attacks or let me just mash regular attack over and over.
Yeah, I think this combat system is the core of what's made like both SMT, the Shin Megami Tensei series that Atlus created kind of before Persona, and Persona as kind of what's made those two franchises last into the modern era, using a turn-based system so long. It's kind of this twist on the standard, let's just use attack, or we'll cast, Ultima over and over again, or whatever. Like, this makes you kind of think about who you want to attack, what you want to attack them with, and prioritizing different weaknesses and getting those bonus turns, like you said. And I think Metaphor does this overall a lot better than even Persona does in the later games, because you're getting these extra turns, whereas in like Persona, you would only like you could attack over and over and over again, basically, as long as you're knocking out weaknesses. Whereas here, it's not as infinite. Like there's still a little more strategic element at play.
So in Persona, it was like it didn't use a turn if you hit a weakness?
Yeah, like you would automatically get another turn for that character. So if that character could hit every weakness, then you could hit all those weaknesses. And then what would happen is every enemy would get into like a knocked down state, and then you could use an all-out attack with all of your characters at one time could all-out attack.
Okay, I kind of remember that now.
You remember that? Yeah. So that was kind of, you were always driving to get to the all-out attack. You were always trying to knock down every enemy and then get the all-out attack, which was a system that worked well enough on its own and is interesting on its own in its own way. But I think Metaphor does something equally interesting and maybe even more interesting with it by not giving you the ability to like wipe out the team like that as quickly.
Something I complain about in a lot of games is when like the decision trees are just like a wishbone, like when it's just like there's two decisions and one of them is the clear obvious one. What I really like about this game is that you are constantly balancing different things in combat, right? So it's like, okay, is it better for me to try to heal and buff this round so I can like have a better position to start from in the next round? Or should I just be trying to end them as soon as possible so they don't get an attack off and I get more of the resources? Or should I be like weaving in these weaknesses? Should I be using pass? Because if you pass your turn, it only uses half of a pip, like you hit someone's weakness, but obviously you didn't do anything. But sometimes it's just useful to like get to the next character, right? And that's not even talking about the defense and the items and the synthesis abilities, which combine two characters' turns into one. There's just so many things to actually think about when you fight. I think that's what I really liked about it. It's just the sheer variety of options, many of which are viable instead of like there being the one true calling there.
Right, like if you look at like a Final Fantasy game or something, a lot of times you're starting off the battle with like, we're going to cast Haste on everybody, we're going to cast Shell, we're going to cast Protect, okay, now we're locked in for the battle, and then we're going to, and it's like this, you're kind of having to change on the fly a little bit more. Enemies are quicker to debuff you or buff themselves, and you're having to kind of figure out what the next best path is, and that path could change for you versus how I would handle it. And a lot of that freedom has to do with the class system, I think, that is at the core of this game and what makes it so different from a lot of Atlus's other RPGs.
Yeah, the class system is pretty fantastic. They're called Archetypes, and you start off with a couple, and as you get more followers and more party members, you unlock more. And the way it works is like you get more skills as you level these up. But then they have like levels to them, I guess. There's 3, some only have 2, some have 3. They're called lineages, right? So your knight lineage starts off as like a knight, and then it becomes like, magic knight, and then it becomes like paladin or kind of a dark paladin.
Yeah, dark knight or something, yeah.
Yeah, so some of the 3 ones split at the end, and you really have 4 total choices. But it's really all balanced around the idea that like you wanna put different people in different things so you can hit all these different weaknesses, and then not only that, but you unlock these skills permanently in a sense. So when you switch classes, you can carry over up to 4 based on how much you've leveled up that follower, right? So it's like you want to have both a variety of skills, but also not spread yourself too thin to where then you're just like the weakest version of everything. And I found that balance a lot of fun, even if ultimately like I picked a lot of whack combinations that didn't benefit me by the end of the game. It's still just a lot of fun to really have very versatile characters that can handle almost any situation because it's got some like diversity to its skill set, and it's not just like this person is a knight and only a knight, and this person is a healer and only a healer. There's a lot of hybridization going on because of the way the skill inheritance across the different classes works.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of the most interesting things about all of Atlus's games is that balance between you need to level up your followers or your relationships. They're called like social links in other games, but in all the games, right, in all the Persona style games, there's this balance between leveling up the follower social links and that directly correlating to benefits in combat. And I think this game does it better than any of the other games before because they're so directly tied to those archetype lineages. So you have to be conscious of which followers you're talking to, who you're leveling up, who you're spending time prioritizing in the overworld, because that will directly translate to how powerful you can get in combat. And I think that balance is really, important in the game to kind of keep some of the story stuff. Like if you start to lose interest or steam in some of the story elements, that will keep you driven to still pursue that stuff because it will help you directly in combat. And I think that balance is just kind of an extension of what you're talking about the kind of freedom of choice and kind of how you want to progress certain things. And I really like that about the archetype system here.
Yeah, and all of it really revolves around this idea that you're trying to be efficient in your actions, right? So when it comes to the calendar system, you can only do 2 things a day, like 2 actions, right? If you're doing a dungeon, you can only really do 1 that day. And you always only have so many days before the next big story event. So it's all about like getting in your conversations with your followers to level them up, getting in the side quest for the extra money and experience, and making sure that you don't miss the deadline for the dungeon, which always like you can do in a single day, but I think you're sort of meant to probably take a couple because you can come back. And all of this kind of relates to the second thing you optimize, which is your MP in this game. Now, another thing I'll mention here is that the way you get into battles in this game, there's a little bit of like an overworld combat system. So it's like if you beat up on someone before the kind of JRPG battle starts, you can get a stun, and that basically lets you have like a free round, right? And this really helps you accomplish what I was talking about earlier, where if you win combat without taking any damage, you get like 50% increased everything, right? So it really behooves you to get those stuns on the overworld map, and you do this by kind of like, just sort of like an action system. The ability that you have is based on what class the main character is. So like Gunner, you'll kind of shoot them from far away. The swordsman thing called Seeker, you attack with the sword close up, etc. I think the mage, you do kind of an AoE attack. But for the most part, it's all about like getting that stun off so that you can start the battle with the stun, which allows you to use as few moves as possible and still get bonus experience, because saving your MP is just so core in these dungeons.
Yeah, I really liked the overworld kind of dungeon map battle thing. I know it is kind of a very simplistic, just quick couple button presses to get into the action, but to me it felt a lot better than like random battles. It felt better than what Persona typically does, where it's like you just press X to get a surprise attack or whatever. Like, and those things are all fine and dandy, I guess, like they work, but this just felt a little more dynamic. Like you would have to kind of position yourself, you have to watch out for the enemy attack, you can dodge their attacks. There's just a little bit more dynamism to it, I guess, and it felt really satisfying to get those hits off and then start the battle with that extra bonus attack.
Yeah, because they can hit you too, and then it's an ambush, and then it's the opposite.
And that is awful.
It unfortunately does feel miserable, like so bad to where it only happened to me once, and not because like I like only got hit once, but because I would just run away from every single ambush and then restart the fight because there's almost no reason not to.
Yeah, and I don't know if there maybe should be like, I don't know the way to balance that, right? Should there be a penalty for running away, or should it just be like maybe you can't get ambushed, but it's like then what's the point of the overworld combat system? Like, I don't know exactly how to balance that, but I'm with you in that like ambushing just felt terrible.
Instead, about 20 hours into the game, you get a follower passive where you just can't fail to run away. So I think I think they really expect you to kind of run away from ambushes because they both feel terrible and you can run away pretty easily. But I don't know, maybe that's just an oversight. But yeah, back to the MP thing. This game doesn't give you just like a plethora of MP restoring items, so that getting those stuns is super important because you're going to use less MP to kill the things. And using less MP is super important because you can't just restore it as much as you want through the dungeon. And not being able to restore it is a problem because if it takes you an extra day to do this dungeon, that's like an extra day you don't get to talk to your followers and stuff. So there's like a lot of pressure on you to do things efficiently, but I wouldn't say it's too crazy. Like as someone who didn't necessarily have a lot of that like institutional Persona knowledge coming into the game, I still mostly got everything. I missed a couple of the like secret royal classes. I missed getting a couple followers to max, but I would say like I was able to do 90% of what the game lets you do without kind of coming in with all that experience. So I think it's a nice mix of like kind of that institutional knowledge and being able to just figure things out on your own.
And these games, as crazy as it sounds, right? Like all of Atlus's games do kind of feel designed that way on purpose. Like you almost aren't supposed to get everything on the first run, which is crazy being that they're like 80 plus hour games, all of them. So it's like, you want me to play this game twice? Like, thanks, Atlus. But it really does feel like that's an intentional choice. As someone with the institutional knowledge of Persona a little bit, I found this game a lot more forgiving than pretty much any of the other Persona games. Like, I was able to easily max all the followers, get all the royals, do all the secret stuff. Like, just, again, knowing the persona of it all, right? Knowing how to kind of maximize, always doing as many things that there's virtues in this game, which if you've played Persona, you'll understand they're kind of like your social stats. And in this game, they're like, I can't even remember what they all are. Courage, tolerance, right? Different.
Wisdom, eloquence, and, oh my god, imagination.
Yes, imagination. What a good one.
Yeah.
All of these, you're leveling up through various activities during the day. Like, so every calendar day you can do an activity, and that activity could translate to more tolerance or more eloquence or more whatever.
Or 3 MP, and then you fucking regret it. Like, why would you waste time doing that?
Right.
The game gives you so many waste of fucking time activities. I wish I had figured that out in the first 20 hours, but here we are.
And as someone, right, who's played a lot of these games before, I very quickly realized, like, okay, this one is not going to help me. There's several activities that I never did until that last month, whenever I had kind of done everything I needed to do, and was like, well, I might as well wash my clothes now. Like for the first time in since the beginning of this
nasty
game,
boy.
I'll do some laundry. But they give you a lot of options, so you can choose what you want to do, and it's up to you to learn like what is important. Or you just kind of do what you feel is best, and the game you will still be able to complete the game with a lot of like extra stuff, or having felt like you've accomplished a lot of stuff, even if you're not optimizing. But if you have that institutional knowledge, if you kind of understand quickly what is important and what is not, you can finish this game in the first run pretty easily, in my experience, which is something that I was not able to do with any of the Persona games. Like, I was not able to get even close to like maxing out all the social links or any of that stuff. But this game, I was able to do it without really like looking up anything or like figuring out how to optimize it. So that felt pretty good to me compared to what the Persona games give you to work with.
Some of it feels a little silly to me in that, like, for instance, some characters, like, as soon as you meet them, they're just always right there, and you know exactly where to find them. Other times, it just says you don't know where they are, and you don't know where they are for 30 more hours until this dumb bitch shows up in this town that's, like, on the other side of the map, and you've been trying to talk to her for 40 hours because that was the class you decided to level up, and that was annoying as hell.
All right, Katarina.
And then there were some other times where I'm going to probably edit me out saying dumb bitch, but maybe not. We'll see. And then there was like Basilio. I remember toward the end, I finally maxed out his thing with 3 days left, and then he just never wanted to talk to me. And I don't really know what that was about. So I never got to actually finish his bond because in the last 3 days he was like, nah, we're not having a conversation. I'm like, okay, that's fine, I guess. I'm as imaginative as you want me to be. But but overwhelmingly, I do think it was like, you start to figure it out for sure.
Yeah, and I can definitely understand why, like, maybe that's frustrating not having kind of known how some of that stuff works. Because, like, I went through all those struggles with Persona 3 and Persona 4 and Persona 5 back when I played those games. So I'm like, okay, I know what to expect here. I know that I need to do this stuff with a little bit of leeway or else it will not get done because there's always that little thing, right? Basilio's thing is just he doesn't talk to you after you finish the link for like 2 or 3 days to do the next quest. Like, that doesn't matter when you finish it. That will always happen. So, like, I finished it like 2 weeks in advance, and there was still that like weird 3-day gap. And I'm like, why won't you talk to me? And then all of a sudden he was just ready to talk to me. I was like, okay, well, like, cool, I guess.
Which to me seems like a really weird choice when you're on such a time crunch, but whatever. I guess I'm just bitter because I didn't figure it out.
Yeah, again, I think Atlus has designed this specifically with the intention of you not actually finishing it all, and like wanting you to go back and do it again to optimize and get it all like figured out on a second run. Like that, it feels like how they designed these games, which is, again, crazy for the length of them, but it feels very intentional of like, you might figure it out by the end, but that might be too late. Come back and play the game in New Game Plus, and you'll have all the knowledge, and you'll be aware, and you'll be able to fill it all out for sure.
And maybe now we can get into some just kind of high level story beats. We'll probably save spoilers toward the end, but I do think it's important to bring up because this game kind of has a way of just tying a lot of the mechanics into the narrative in some way or another. They talk about the archetypes and how there's these ancient powers, and magic is kind of dead in this world outside of people who use essentially magic wands, right? But you're using like the magic of the old ways, and the weather that impacts battles. You can't trigger weaknesses. Well, people talk about that. It's like every little mechanic kind of gets its like conversation in the real world, right? Compared to something like, you think about like Mass Effect, the fact that you're a soldier or a vanguard has nothing to do with anything, and it never will. Whereas this game kind of, it talks about those different things, and then like the main character's royal is like, maybe there's a bit of a spoiler, but it's like a specific title that makes sense for him in the story. So like all of that kind of ties together. So why don't you start off just kind of high level? What's going on in this kingdom, and why do we care?
Yeah, so this game starts with the king of this kingdom, King Hypholodius, or whatever the heck his name is.
Yeah, that's as good a guess as any.
This game leads off with him being assassinated by a character named Luis Guillaborn, something like that. There's a lot of like fantasy bullshit names in here that I might butcher.
I won't be correcting you on any of them.
Okay, perfect. So the king is assassinated by Luis, and we find out that the king's son, the prince, is in a like cursed state, and we follow our main character, who is kind of a silent protagonist archetype, a silent protagonist stereotype, if you will. And he's semi-silent, and you can name him whatever you want. His canon name is Will. I just wanted to point that out because, like, Will of the People. This game is very on the nose about a lot of its metaphors.
Jeez.
So the Resistance, which is kind of like this weird. They don't ever like really describe what the Resistance is. They kind of mention it towards the end, but. It just
the game starts and you're just part of it.
Yeah, it's just this very ambiguous, like you are thrown into this world and you are this character who is off to assassinate Luis and lift the curse on the prince because you believe that the prince has been cursed by Luis. And some things happen, but the big kind of main story center is that when you're attempting to assassinate Luis, a giant like rock comes out of the sky. It looks like a meteor almost, kind of like from Majora's Mask. And it's got the king's face on it, the now deceased king. And it's like being possessed by his magic, and basically says like, you can't assassinate Luis because the people will choose who the new king is. Like instead of the royal bloodline, instead of Luis taking power by overthrowing the church or any of this stuff, we're going to let the people decide who the next ruler is. And this kind of sets the whole story in motion and kind of sets all these things around so that it makes sense that you're talking to these people and you're recruiting followers because you're trying to win the hearts of the people to be king for the prince. You're trying to do this like for the prince, but you're kind of the avatar of the prince, if you will. And so that's kind of what puts all this stuff in motion.
And the followers really do have like a bunch of different angles in which they're trying to impact the world, right? So you have the one guy, he's the commander lineage, right? I forget his name, but he is kind of like a local governor, and he goes through all of these different, oh my God, the people are so stupid, I'm going to lead them to glory, to, oh my God, I'm so stupid, I can't like figure this out. Governing's actually really hard, to kind of rounding out at the end that you really give him like the confidence to realize that like everyone makes mistakes, and being a good leader isn't about being perfect. It's about like, making the best of the situation and always striving for improvement and harnessing the will of the people to get things done instead of this top-down approach. And then you have like this, the magic lady, Bridget. She kind of starts off as just this like really cold, callous person, but then you end up like babysitting her dog, and then her dog gets
the cutest dog.
It is. Then her dog gets like kidnapped or something because they're not supposed to have dogs in the magic shop. I didn't quite understand the beginning of that one, but by the end of it, she is trying to use magic technology to create like toys and stuff instead of weapons. And so all of these followers just have this kind of like journey they go through where by the end their philosophy and their way of looking at the world kind of changes, and that proceeds at a very similar pace to, you know, the way the people of the world kind of do, because you can't really do all these all at once, right? There are some time gauge to these.
Right.
So it kind of progresses with the narrative.
Yeah, and a lot of this is the followers do a really good job of kind of building out the world as well. Like having all of these conversations and talking to everybody, you see different parts of the world and different characters' struggles. There's 7 different, there's really more than 7, but there's like 7 main races. There's a couple other ones that you don't get party members of, but they're like kind of insignificant. And these like 7 races all have their own struggles and their own like history and lore. Like there's the Mustari, who are a like religion. They're like a people that are kind of sequestered on an island, and there's not many of them on the mainland, and they have their own religion and their own beliefs that go against the established religion of the mainland. Euchronia is the name of the like whole continent, I think, or even the world. Is it the world? It's a little blurry, but
yeah, I think Euchronia is like the kingdom now that the 3 like nations have united.
You're right. Yeah, Euchronia is the 3 nations, and then there's this island kind of off to the side where the Mustari live, and they're not really technically part of the kingdom, and they have their own beliefs and their own, you know, ideas, and you can talk to different Mustari that have made it to the mainland, and one of your party members becomes a Mustari, or I guess a Mustari becomes one of your party members, and you can kind of learn about all of these different religions and beliefs and the struggles of the different classes, and all of this kind of ties into all these follower conversations. So I think they're really important to have to build out the world building of this land.
Yeah, and I like how there's definitely enough like real world analogs to where you can kind of pick up on some of this without a ton of detailed explanation for the game, right? So for instance, the Sanctus, they're kind of like the majority religion on the mainland. It's just very obviously like a monotheistic Christ-like or Christianity type of religion, right?
For sure.
The Mustari, they remind me a little bit of something like the Aztecs, because they have this whole like human sacrifice thing going on, and they kind of have a weird relationship with the wider world that gets even more complicated when Hernando Cortez, the main character, arrives on the island. And no, you're not so much a conquistador or anything like that, but there are just like a lot of cultural struggles and a lot of cultural clashing as these things mix. I don't know that there's as much as I would have liked between all of the races, particularly on the mainland, because there are so many, but you really do see some of their conflicts kind of take more of a center stage, like the Mustari, like the Elda. But they do a decent job fleshing those out. And like most of the towns have someone that you can increase your tolerance virtue by listening to them talk. And they're basically talking about the culture of these races. There's like one for each of the races scattered around the world. So it's kind of all about like how much time do you want to put into learning the world. But there's definitely stuff there if you wish to dive into it.
Yeah, and I think, I do think all the races kind of have their own unique things about them. And I know we've kind of talked about how they do appear a little bit too similar in like physical appearance. A lot of them are just humanoid with like slightly different characteristics. Like, oh, this one has ears.
Sexy bunny ears, sexy horns.
Right.
They just look like a girl's Halloween outfit.
Just sexy blank something is really all the classes, except for the Yufa, who are just like, for some reason, some weird like rabbit creature. like
yeah, there's the anthropomorphized animals because it's a Japanese game and you just literally can't do that without that.
Of course.
But then beyond that, they all pretty much appear very human-like, although, like you said, some have like these tiny horns, some have like the ears. One of them is actually like, you kind of find this out late in the game, so slight spoiler, but they're really this weird tiny creature that uses like magic to appear more humanoid to avoid discrimination. So there are some unique things about it. I do think the game kind of dilly-dallies in giving you the information that makes you realize that they're not all the same thing, but it is there. It is there.
Yeah, and there's a lot of themes in here that are touched on, and we can debate the effectiveness with which they do their themes, but I think one of the core themes, has a lot to do with the core idea of a like strength and unity idea, that all these different races are being kind of discriminated against, and And different ones, the Clamar are kind of the ruling class. They're like the ruling nobles. They're the horn guys. And they have been the king lineage, and they're most of the nobles. And like, the Risanti are kind of the knight militant force. And they also have a lot of nobility, and they're like the second most populous race. And as you play through this, you kind of take the races that are, kind of discriminated against, the Papyrus, who are kind of the more animal-like creatures, and the Yufa, who are the weird bat rabbit things that we were talking about earlier. And you recruit a party member from each of these classes throughout the game, so that the core theme of like all these classes need to come together and unite to pick a ruler, to pick a governing style that works best for everybody, is a key thing that I think the game tries to portray. And I think it does it pretty well, especially with that idea of like all the people that you're talking to, the classes that you're interacting, or the races that you're interacting with, the party members that you're interacting with, are all, those different races. So you can kind of see that unity come across all the way throughout the game.
Yeah, and that's very much like the classic, I guess, like diverse cast trope, right? I mean, Mass Effect does it, Star Wars does it. There's always like a couple members of an alien here and there, and you typically don't have many duplicates beyond your sort of base human-like thing, which we haven't brought up yet. Humans in this game are actually giant monsters that look like bad AI art people, and they're just like nightmare fuel. I'm not saying the art itself is bad, but I just mean like really weird like amalgamations and manifestations of monsters and shit mixed with like human features.
That's actually an awesome way to describe them. Like just like bad AI art creations that is actually like good art on its own. It actually takes inspiration from a lot of like classic artists. I forget the one guy's name, but some of them are literally like exact copies of these paintings from this like classic artist that are directly translated into this game. I wish I could remember his name.
And so many of these themes really just continue to build on themselves throughout the story, right? Because so where do we leave off here? There's the assassination of the king, and then the king's like, hey, we're going to have something more resembling a popular vote to choose the next leader. And then the Sanctus Church is like, yes, we have this tournament to prove to the people who's the best. And that's your typical, like, we need to do the three things because it's an RPG. Yep. And more than three things is too much for people's brains. So the next couple dozen hours is basically like doing these three different tasks. And the whole time you're continuing to build these things up, right? You learn about the church and you learn about Lewis more. So it's like, okay, kind of this religious status quo versus like a bloodthirsty revolutionary. And then you through some of the followers, you start exploring those themes of like self-governance and reason over superstition. And like, is there actually hope for us to change this world? I think some of the guys are a little more cynical when you first start following them. I'm trying to think of them. Another spoiler here. The dude that fakes his own death toward the end, I can't remember. Alonzo, is that his name?
Oh, yes, the follower. Yes, Alonzo.
Yeah, so I think he's like the faker lineage. Yeah, so he starts off just almost sounding kind of like a scam artist, and you're not really sure like what he's up to. But then by the end of that, it's this nice thing where like you're trying to figure out what to do with his inheritance or whatever. So it's like there's always these themes building on each other throughout the narrative, throughout the side narratives, through the follower narratives. And I think it does a pretty good job. Maybe there's times where it's a little messy or heavy-handed, but it typically doesn't like leave them to die. You do get some resolution and some overall point to these themes, I think, at some point or another.
So kind of at this point of the story, right, things are happening. Our characters progress through this challenge and one of this like royal tournament challenge. And one of the major events in this challenge is that we're trying to find a relic, a like old world relic from that the church wants to bring all of them together to like bless them and lock them into a vault or whatever, so people don't have them. This is kind of posed as a celebration of the Sanctus Church and to like kind of establish its authority, but for the church it's really just a way to get these relics that are like potentially dangerous to their rule kind of out of the like public and lock them behind a vault.
Yeah, and much like the real world, despite it being we're going toward like a popular vote here. You're just going to have all of these special interest groups and organizations that are trying to manipulate things, because of course they are.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So the church is like organizing this tournament in a way to where they hope it will make their candidate, Fordrin, the leader of the church, look good to the people, because ultimately that's what all this is about, right?
Right, which they literally say multiple times. They're like, yes, we'll make sure that the next challenge reestablishes the Sanctus Church authority, and Fortin will rule for sure. And it's like, that's not the spirit of this. Which is, right, the whole thing that you're trying to challenge and one of the major themes of the game. See, it all comes back together. But in this particular challenge, right, you're kind of working with Luis. He's your enemy. You want to stop him. But you're working kind of in disguise, like you're working undercover for him to try and get close to him so that you can have this moment to take him out. So he tasks you with fulfilling his part of this challenge, and that is finding this spear called Dracodius, or Dracodius, however you want to pronounce it. And
I don't.
Fair enough. So that's when you go to this island, the Mustari Island. You recruit a priestess from the Mustari. Her name's Yufa. She tries to sacrifice herself. You stop her. You get this spear. And we're going to kind of dig deep into spoilers here. So this is kind of your big spoiler warning. We're going to get into the big kind of twist of the game. You take this spear back to Luis, and there's this scene in an opera house where you're going to like present all these relics, and you set a plan to basically kill Luis at this opera house using this spear, which you find out can kill him. We didn't talk about the royal magic at all.
The magic basically says like the candidates that are in the running can't just murder each other. There's like protection so that this has to be decided by the people. The caveat is if they decide to willingly duel each other.
Right, and this spear can break through the royal magic without the caveat of the willingly duel. You're going to use this spear now to kill Luis instead of giving it to him like he wants. And I feel like this is where the story starts to kind of go off the rails for some people. I feel like the people who complain about the story, which I don't know how many there really are, because this did win like Best Narrative at the Game Awards and has won like a ton of Game of the Year stuff. So I don't know how controversial this is, but I feel like for the people that it doesn't work for, this is where that starts. And Adam, I know you're one of those people maybe. So do you want to dig into that a little bit?
Well, I really like the setup, right? There's really a couple dungeons leading up to this that feel kind of like a heist movie, and you're doing different things to really like get the plan going off perfectly. And it's not even that the results of it are all that silly. I think there's just a few details that feel kind of dumb. So you're on top of this roof and you're dueling Louis, right? And does he have the real spear at this point?
I think he has the real spear because you've stabbed him with it and you couldn't pull it back.
That's right. So the plan kind of goes off correctly. You throw the spear from the chandelier above the opera while Juna's performing, and that's one of your party members, and it hits him. But then, like, Yufa is supposed to be able to pull the spear back, but, like, it won't come back. So you're like, man, is he not dead? What's wrong? Then you end up meeting him on the roof, and he's like, I have the spear now. It's over for you. But it's not, because he's got a spear through his chest, so he's not at full power. You defeat him. He falls through the roof and, like, hits the ground. Right in the middle of, like, the opera house, right? So, like, Fordrin's there. Like, everyone's nearby. And then, like, he has this necromancer minion that you fight once before. And apparently this guy didn't die when you killed him the first time. And now he's just dressed up as a member of the priesthood. And he's the only one allowed to go check Louis' pulse. And everyone's like, cool, new guy. No reason you'd lie about that. And then it's like they actually swapped it for a fake. So Fordrin doesn't have the real one. I forget the exact details. And I don't so much mind the fake spear. I mean, they kind of explain how that works. And the necromancer guy is there to like pull some of this together. It just feels a little weird to me because the game starts to make it seem like maybe Louis is going to die and like Fordrin will take over. That ends up not being the case. Fordrin dies. Louis continues to be the main antagonist, which I don't think is necessarily a terrible decision because Louis is pretty good as a villain, I think.
Yeah, I think Louis is a pretty cool villain. I think he's one of the better Atlus villains, I think.
Yeah, before his motivation at the very end just becomes another like Thanos like fucking mess of motivation. He seems pretty grounded most of it. But the whole thing just feels a little contrived, particularly with the necromancer. It's like the plan really involved him having to like not die at multiple points where he easily could have died. and then the necromancer being the only one allowed to check his pulse. It feels a little silly, but like ultimately it works just because I think the buildup is really fun, and that whole heist-like nature of it's really fun. And then, of course, the reveal when Louis is dead for a small period of time, right? Because I guess the necromancer like brings him back or something. But it's,
yeah, I mean, he heals him. Like,
yeah. But he is dead long enough for you to realize that the curse is not tied to Louis. The curse of the prince is clearly something else, because this whole time you think if you kill Luis, the prince will be cured, and he doesn't wake up. So you're like, oh shit, what's actually causing the curse here? And that is sort of like the end of Act 1 almost. Like,
yeah, kind of. They happen at two very different times, but I kind of compare this scene for anybody who's played Persona 5, right? I don't want to compare these games the entire time, even though I will, but they're very similar games, so like I almost have to. I almost feel like this moment is the kind of end of Persona 5. There's like a big twist reveal thing that happens, and it feels set up in a very similar way. Like, you have a plan, and that twist is a little bit different because you are the one executing the like twist part instead of the villain executing the plan. Like, you execute a plan to get one over on the villains. But it feels like that moment, and people really highlight that moment of Persona 5 as one of the best moments in the game. Like, everybody loves it. They're like, oh my god, the twist works so much more effectively than the reaction I've seen to the metaphor twist. Because
Gotcha.
Even outside of you, I've seen some people react, kind of like, the Opera House scene doesn't really work for me. And I'm curious what the difference is in those two, and maybe one day I'll take some time to like sit down and analyze the difference between the two and see why I think one works over the other. I didn't mind the Opera House scene. I think what keeps it kind of working is the reveals and the twists and the things that kind of keep it going at a really fast pace. And then like right after that, you've been traveling with two people, Basilio and Del, who are like Luis's followers, and Del ends up sacrificing himself to save some people that Luis is trying to kill, which is something that the Del that you met at like the start of your travels would never have done. So it feels like you've seen some progression of this character and some growth of this character, and I think that kind of the reveals and that sacrifice of Del kind of brings it all together to still be a satisfying scene for me. But I'm curious why like the Persona 5 twisty reveal scene works so much better for people than this one. And I just found that interesting.
I do think it works well enough. Like, it doesn't necessarily bring anything to a screeching halt. It does give Luis a little bit of annoying plot armor, is what it kind of feels like. But they don't do nothing with it, right? Because now there's really some discord in the church about who is now going to represent the Sanctus, and there's some infighting about that, and the whole Sanctism starts to like really crack and fall apart at this point, I think. So it's not as if there's no reasoning to it. It's not as if it doesn't have like ramifications, right? So I don't hate this twist nearly as much as I hate one later in the game. But this, like you said, this is where some people I think start to kind of maybe lose their interest in the story. But I do think the full package works well enough because the setup is just a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, were you still relatively invested in the main story and carrying on through like story wise?
Yeah, I would say so. The next thing that kind of happens is you actually find out that like, what is it, Juna's adoptive sister, Rella, is who actually cast the curse. And, she was under pressure from the Sanctus to do it for some reason or another. It wasn't necessarily something that she, like, wanted to do, right?
Right. I mean, they were threatening to kill Juno. Like, they were, like, Ford made some very not veiled threats, basically, to say, like, we will kill your sister if you don't do this. And Rella really liked her sister, so,
This whole scene was a little weird to me because we've only met Rella, like, once before this, right? We asked her a question about someone's, like, sickness or injury or something.
The prince. You're asking her about the princess curse. That's right.
So then it turns out it's really her, and I just find that this next bit is resolved so fast. I just couldn't possibly care about any of this. It's just like she's throwing on a front about how like no, actually, like, I'm going to rule the Sanctus Church now, blah, blah, blah. But none of it's real because she's just trying to test you. And then you go fight her, and now she's frozen in a block. But before that, she tells everyone that you're actually the real prince and they should follow you, which does turn out to be true, but no one, including you, knows this yet. So it's kind of like they're trying to set it up to where the protagonist is someone that the people will rally behind. So he's actually the prince, and you just plan to lie about this, and Rella helps you lie about this. And then 15 hours later, it turns out that's actually the case. But we'll get there.
Well, okay, so I do take a little bit, like, you're planning about lying about it, yes, but the idea is that you look just like the prince. So, like,
because there's only 2 Elda on the entire planet. So
that's not true. Luis is also an Elda. Thank you.
but he's got the fucking horn, so no one knows that.
Sure, there are more Elda. I think they're just hiding, right? They're just not out and about much. Anyway, the point being, you look just like the prince. So yes, you're lying about this, but the idea is that you're going to pull the old switcheroo, right? Like, you're lying to get people to rally behind you, and then you will give the real prince the crown. Like, you're not trying to take the crown from the prince or anything. You're just pulling the old switcheroo. So the lying is in an effort to get people to rally behind you so that you could give the prince the support, right? Like, it makes sense.
When you say you look exactly like the prince, what you mean is that the game states that you look exactly like the prince, because you fucking don't. Like, in fact, this protagonist has one of the dumbest appearances of any game I've ever played. I hate this character the whole way through it. I never stop hating him. And part of that's because, like, there's barely anything there. It's a semi-silent protagonist with a stupid haircut and 2 different colored eyes. And, like, I've just described 99% of what this guy is. So, I don't know, dude. He just doesn't work for me, like, at all.
That's fair. Because what you do realize right after this, right, is, like, you go to... Some things happen. At this point, your reputation, right? There's a system in this game called reputation that we haven't really mentioned, but it's a mechanic, I guess, that is tied to how popular you are. So as you do different quests and help different people and talk to your followers and blah, 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 your number will go higher. It's kind of like Mass Effect 3's Galactic Readiness score, kinda, but it doesn't have as many mechanical, like, actual game effects, because it's really just a story. It's really just a story representation of how popular you are, and they give it to you in a number, right? So it's like, as that number goes technically closer to 1, right? It goes down because you're getting more and more popular. So, like, you're the number 1 or 2 or whatever.
It's like a ranking.
Right. So at this point, your number is, like, very high after this happens. But you're like 2, I think, at this point. It's just you and Luis, so the 2 candidates left in the running, really. And you go to meet Luis in the grand capital, like in front of the church, to have a battle. He basically throws down the gauntlet and says, let's have a challenge, me and you, let's see who's fit to rule, right? Let's see who the real, like, is my strength versus your ideology, which one is better. Let's meet and match in the middle, right? And you get there and you're beating up on Luis and you think you're going to win, but this game is clearly not over yet. So Luis does this thing where he basically turns you into a human, right? The human that we mentioned earlier, that is the disastrous monstrosity that everyone's afraid of. And he turns you into this human, and you kind of... Some magic is involved, right? This is a fantasy game. There's some magic shit involved that you go back to your normal self, but now everybody's terrified of you. So you flee to the Elden Sanctuary to go meet with the prince, who is, like, now coming out of his curse because Rella has died. So you go to meet with the prince in the Elden Sanctuary and flee from this danger zone. And this is when kind of some of the other big reveals start to happen.
Just to touch on the reputation again, though, it reminded me a lot of, like, Mass Effect 3 War Readiness, and that it just, like, was so uninteresting and didn't matter. Because it's like there's a point in the game where you will get to, if you do anything but laundry over and over, where your gains just no longer do anything. Like, you've hit whatever cap the game has put for this point in the narrative, and you can't progress past it. Even if you could, it doesn't matter, because after you turn into a human, it just resets it anyway. And then this happens again late in the game, where there's, like, another section where it's like, you got to build your reputation back up before we go fight Luis for the last time. And there's just another soft cap on it until more narrative stuff happens. It's really just kind of like smoke screens and mirrors. And I think it's trying to make you feel like there's something you're building to with all this. And I don't think it's necessary, because ultimately, like, I feel like the narrative should be enough to carry this, and not just this arbitrary number that truly means nothing and just stops going up at a certain point.
Yeah, I would say the only difference between this and Galactic Readiness is that like Galactic Readiness actually has major impacts on how the game ends.
That's true. The ending does change based on that number.
Where this has nothing to do with that. This is literally just, it's not even a mechanic, really. It's just a numerical representation of how popular you are to the people.
Yeah.
The only time it ever really comes into play is if you talk to the gambling guy in the water city, which name I can't remember at the moment. But there's like a gambling guy, and if you talk to him, he'll be like, where do you think your galactic, or I almost said galactic readiness. He's like, where do you think your reputation will be by this date? So you're basically like betting on yourself to have done enough.
I never came across that. That's cool.
Yeah, so you could talk to this guy, and you're basically betting on yourself to be like what reputation number will you be at by this date? And so if you make it to that number, then you get like a monetary reward or something. It's not anything dramatic, but that is maybe the only time it ever comes into play, like mechanically.
Yeah, so the next big reveal happens around here. And you can definitely like tell me if I'm wrong about any of this. But essentially the way it works is like you show up and the prince is kind of like awoken, but didn't like Luis get there first and you're worried he's like dead or something, right?
It's not Luis. It's the necromancer guy whose name is escaping.
So Luis is minion, his like number one minion,
right? Whose name is escaping me still.
But then it's like, oh, he's not actually in danger because the whole time he was you, and you're like, so you're sort of like a manifestation of his like will, I guess, which is why they call him Will.
Yeah, it's double, right? It's the will of the people, but you're the will of the prince to kind of explore and travel and like unify the world, right? Like the prince is the one who has this vision of utopia that this game is kind of centered around, right? This idea that people shouldn't be ruled and people shouldn't be oppressed, and or if they are being ruled, they should be ruled by someone who's just and wants the best for all of them, and blah 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 blah. And so the prince, I think, has this ideal world in his mind from this book that he's been reading this book from the beginning of the game. Like you kind of see in flashbacks. And Will has this book now, this same book that the king has, or that the prince has, and also that Luis happens to have this book as well. And the prince has this like ideal vision of utopia, and Will, your main character, becomes the manifestation of his will for that utopia, I think.
So I think where this really falls flat for me is I was wondering kind of through most of the game, like, okay, so when the prince awakens, this is going to be interesting because like what actually are his philosophies on governing and stuff, right? Like we're putting him up as the candidate. It'll be interesting to find out when he wakes up what he thinks about a lot of these things, particularly given that his family was the one ruling things before and apparently everyone hates it. So like how is his worldview going to change based on these new developments and everything? But it turns out he's not fucking real, so he doesn't have any opinions or philosophies on anything. It's just you, and all of yours are just an amalgamation of everyone around you. Because the only conversations in this game that you can have are yes and no, but actually yes. So you're just reaffirming all of your party members' kind of like ideas on things, and it's like you're just a blank slate for your party to fill up, which works mechanically, I think, because you have all these conversations yourself. It just doesn't make much sense narratively to me because it's like, what is this candidate at the end of the day? It's just like the 7 closest friends of his influencing him. Oh, so a dictator? Well, like, and they're the keys to the kingdom? This like I
don't necessarily think that's true because I think the vision and I understand where you're coming from, and I don't necessarily entirely disagree. But the Utopia book that I briefly mentioned a few minutes ago is kind of your basis for ruling, right? Because they even talk about it in this reveal, right? Where they say like, you seem to have a lot of the same ideas and beliefs that the prince has, and that like everything that you do seems to kind of be what would the prince do. And Gallica kind of mentions that in this reveal. She's like, everything you do seems to relate to what the prince would do. Why is that? Oh, it's because you are the prince, right? Like you are the manifestation of the prince. And that his driving ideas are behind that book, that Utopia book. That's actually based on a real book, I think. I think it's called Utopia. I don't remember who it's by, but it's actually based on a real book by some guy. And that is kind of your driving philosophy is following that book, which is why at the end, which I don't want to jump too far ahead, but like at the end, when you kind of realize that the stories in the book aren't quite as utopic as you realize, your philosophy changes a little bit. Because that is the philosophy that you've been following so far, is like you're chasing this utopia, because that's what the prince wanted. So you are the prince in that same way, and you're trying to chase this utopia that's described in the book that he has.
There's a scene early in the game where it's supposed to mimic like you're the prince's childhood friend and you're like having this conversation with him. And I was like really looking forward to the reunion because I really wanted to know like what the relationship between these two was, because the game really made it seem like there was something there. And I guess like there's definitely a relationship there, technically speaking. They're the same person. But like, yeah, I don't know. I see what you're saying as far as I guess his philosophy was like embodied by the book. But then, yeah, again, not to skip too far ahead, but it's like we spend 80 hours in democracy to just elect the next person in the bloodline of the ruling royal family. And to me, this is just like so stupid. It's just so stupid.
Yes. And I would agree with you, I guess, except that it's still the people's choice. Like, you still win the contest. Not the contest, I guess. The contest kind of dissolves when the church gets, like, destroyed. But you still win the popular vote, right? Like, you still win the people's hearts. So, yes, I guess you do elect the next prince. And I have heard that as kind of a complaint out there from other people, too. And I understand it, but it's not that he got it just because he was the prince. You still win the people's hearts. Like, for most of the game, you don't even know that you are the prince. Like,
maybe this is intentional, but it feels very much like you win the people's hearts in the same way that like the US presidential election wins the people's hearts, right? You have two choices and people decide one's worse than the other. Because it just comes down to like you and Louis, and everyone's on Louis' side because he's manipulating them through anxiety magic. Then when they break out, they're like, wow, what an awful thing he did to us. I guess we'll pick the one other choice.
Well, but you've already eliminated all the other choices by being the better candidate, right? Like, all the other choices have actually fallen to your ideals, right? The other choices that you've had, like Katarina, the bunny girl, right? Like, she drops out to follow you. You've recruited Alonzo. You've recruited the governor guy whose name we forgot. Like, you've recruited all these people throughout all the places to your side and to your philosophy, and they are supporting you.
You also kill, well, I guess you don't kill them, but you also do go defeat like 4 of the candidates in their little gauntlet runners around the map, right?
You do go defeat a couple of the candidates. You're right. Those are the ones who are too stubborn.
The people who won't listen need to be subdued, is what I'm hearing.
Well, whenever they're like crazy like assholes, like, yeah, maybe. Seems like it could maybe be true to life. I do get where you're coming from, though. Some of the themes can get a little muddied towards the end as far as like what is being said and what the game like wants to portray and what actually happens. But I don't know, to me that almost makes it more interesting because there's like more to dig into there than just like the colorful rainbows of everything happens exactly as planned.
Sure. What I will say is that I find it, so it's not just the prince, right? It's the fact that like quite literally by the end of the game, it's the prince, the king, and the queen have been so heavily involved in this journey of like popular sovereignty that it's so weird to me how important the like monarchy stays through the entire process. And I guess it's almost like, imagine the French Revolution where like the revolutionaries lost. Like, that's kind of what this feels like. Maybe other than the fact that the royal family's never like quite depicted as like terrible rulers, but there's obviously a bunch of like dissatisfaction with the way things have been.
Yeah, and I definitely get where you're coming from. And there's an element of like Luis is like the radical revolutionary, right? Like, he's the one who's supposed to be the revolutionary. And he is kind of, his beliefs are a little unhinged though, right? It's all like ruling through power and strength directly to the point where like anyone who's weak is just not worthy to be in my kingdom, to the point where at the end, right, and I think we can dive into kind of in-game stuff here, because nothing really happens between this reveal and the actual final confrontation with Luis. It's mostly just like, all right, let's get ready to fight him again. And when we get there, we kind of see that his plan, he wants to turn everyone into humans, and those that survive that transformation are the ones who are strong enough to live in his kingdom. Those are the ones who he believes have the strength to be a part of his kingdom, because the only thing that matters at the end of the day is strength, which kind of flies directly in the face of what he had been saying about like trying to take up the lower classes and build them up, or the lower races, and like, you know, raise them up. And he believed in all races and anyone could be anything. But now it's like, only if you are strong enough to survive through this like transformation of human thing.
And I guess part of what's a little confusing is, so the game is called Metaphor, so I assume there's a lot of that going on. And so King Louis, he would have been the last king before the French Revolution, right? Like Louis the 15th, 16th, married to Marie Antoinette. So in some sense, I think that like Louis in this game is sort of supposed to be like, even though he is the revolutionary, he's really more directly compared to like the brutal king that everyone kind of wants to get rid of, right?
Right.
So they kind of swap those roles there. But I do think he's not named Louis by accident.
Sure. And I think the game does a decent job of kind of pulling all these pieces together. I know you kind of start to lose it here, as we've talked about a little bit, but I think it does a decent job of pulling all these pieces together, of like having Luis be a charismatic leader who like could get the people on his side, but then when the veil comes off, like you see he's just another version of the church, just with a different philosophy, but still one that wants to oppress certain groups of people. And that's what the prince doesn't want, which is why the people elect the prince.
Mm-hmm. And the game sort of has this period at the end where after all these big reveals, you know, you have your 30 days of leveling up and finishing all of your side quests, or failing to finish all your virtues in my case. And
you got so close, though.
I did. I got pretty close. Katarina was the only one I was nowhere close. And I never saw her again after like hour 28. I just don't know where she went.
Did you like never find her on the road? Like, because that's where you're supposed to build up her. Like, by the time you get to Alterberry, she's supposed to be around like level 6. Because
maybe I missed her then. She was just never in Alter. Well, I don't think I ever got her virtue up all the way either. I got it to 4, but I don't think I ever got it to 5.
Oh,
that was the last
but you
one.
didn't like actually get her virtue up, so you couldn't finish hers either.
Yeah, so she was stuck at like level 5. But there's the giant floating demon castle in the sky. This is where Louis is hanging out now. He's got the Scepter of the Kings, which was a big thing in the first couple hours, and then just kind of never mentioned again until the last couple hours, which is supposed to give him some godlike power, and only the king can truly wield it, but he's not the king, and he's wielding it, and you kick his ass anyway, so I don't know what that was about. But so you have the final battle, and I actually thought they were almost going for a, like, you know how in Mass Effect you can talk Saren out of the first phase of his boss fight and make him kill himself? Your party gives a really rousing speech that's really convincing. And I was like, what's his answer to that going to be? And his answer to that is basically like, yeah, I tire of this. It's time to fight now. And it's like, oh, you fucking pussy. But like, so then the battle starts. And here's what I'll get to a little. This is really my only like mechanical complaint about this game, because I really enjoyed a lot of the mechanics in this. This game is never something that I feel like is really wasting your time. Like, the boss battles typically don't take all that long. And within the first 3 to 4 turns, you can usually figure out like, okay, am I going to need to like come at this with a different approach, right? Luis is like a 3-hour long battle, and really, like, he doesn't toss anything that crazy at you until like the last 25% of his final phase, where he decides your entire team gets Malady, which I don't think I had ever gotten as a status effect in the entire game up to that point. The thing that prevents you from being healed. I don't think it once ever happened to me.
It happened to me a couple times. So
that happens, and then like not long after that, you only get 1 turn pip for a whole round, and he starts to get 4 to 6 more per turn, and he just starts like. This is probably just bad luck on my part, but he starts critting with every single one of these. So it was like I basically go from never having anyone below half health to my entire team being dead and unable to be healed in a single round. And I just spent the next few trying to play catch up. Could never actually catch up. And he just eventually finishes me off. And I really hated this because I felt like it just was completely at odds with all of the expectations of the combat up to this point in the game. Because it wasn't a case where I was like, in 3 to 4 turns, I realized that this isn't going to work. Let me restart with a different approach. It was like, 2 hours later, do the whole damn thing over again without a checkpoint in between the two phases. With, I assume you have to watch that whole more reveal again?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think if you just restart the fight, I think you can restart the fight and not have to do the whole more reveal.
But if you die, you have to.
I think you can restart from the beginning of the fight even if you die. I don't think you have to load the whole more reveal. I'm trying to remember because I did die and I did have to go back and do it again.
You definitely have to do both phases. I just can't quite remember where that more reveal
You definitely have to do both phases for sure. I think if you quit out of the game, then yes, you have to do the whole more reveal again because you can't save in between it.
Right.
But if you just die and restart the fight, I think you can do that. I think you can restart the fight and not have to do it all over again. You know what I mean? Of the whole more reveal.
So it's not between the two phases?
No, because there's the one phase, the more reveal, then the second phase, then the third phase.
Okay, so when you die, you actually start at the second phase.
Yeah.
Is what we're thinking. Okay.
Yes, the second phase, because there's only 2 phases that are immediately back to back. That's the one with the 3 faces and then the weird God Luis.
Yeah, that's right.
So you start at the beginning of that second phase.
There is a really cool series of full anime cutscenes during all of this, which are
those are
they're stellar. Yeah. They're really good. It does completely leave its low fantasy roots behind about 10 hours before the end of the game and never looks back, which is just a preference thing. Not my favorite decision, but so it often is at the end of a JRPG, right?
Yeah, you're always fighting God. It's fine.
Yeah.
Kefka literally turns into who even knows what at the end of Final Fantasy VI.
Same with Sephiroth in his final form.
Right.
It's always the case, right? But yeah, I never actually beat him. I went to YouTube to watch it and still never finished it. So I don't actually.
But you never actually finished the ending.
No, I just simply do not care. I do know from what you told me though that there's sort of the way it kind of ends is the idea of that there's still work to do.
Yeah.
You didn't save the kingdom yet, so to speak. All of its cultural issues and whatnot still exist, even though we have killed the demon guy, so that's good. But there's still work to be done. We have to actually put in the work to create a functioning elective monarchy here.
Yeah, so there's a couple good things I like about the ending. Right before the final fight with Luis, right before you go into the demon castle and do all the nonsense in the floating demon castle in the sky, there's this moment where you get to talk to every follower that you've had throughout the whole game, all your party, all the followers. You get to kind of talk to them, hear their last moments, kind of see last moments that they're going to die. They all survive, but you get to hear their thoughts before the final fight and see how you've influenced them. It feels a lot like the end of Mass Effect or a lot of these party-driven RPGs, but I just really like the way it was presented and having that moment where you get to kind of have an end cap on all these followers felt good to me. I really like that moment.
So there's the end cap that you get before the final battle, and then there's more afterwards, right?
Yeah, there's a little bit more that you get to see. There's the end cap before, and then whenever the game is done, there's another probably hour and a half of the game after you beat Luis, where you get to talk to everybody again and see where they are now post Luis fight. It's I don't know how long it is. Is it a year? I think maybe. You're actually probably more fresh because you watched at least some of this cutscene more recently than me. Do you
I have no idea what you're talking about, so clearly not.
There's a flash forward. It's a year later, and you get. I think it's a year, and you're the king. You're crowned the king, the elective king, even though you're the prince, which we've already discussed, and your party members become this council around you. So they're basically your advisors. I think Basilio leads part of the army. Stroll's your right-hand man. Juna's gone and reopened the magic school and is teaching at the magic school. So you kind of get all these little moments with all of your characters, like your UG friend, his name Heisme has like become a captain in the guard as well. Like everybody's kind of gotten this resolution that fits their character, and you kind of see where they are, but there is still this sense of Luis has followers still, and like people are still downtrodden, and like not everybody's happy yet. And it kind of goes with the themes that are addressed earlier, where you realize at a certain point that the book, the story that you've been reading, this utopia that you've been driving towards, wasn't really as much of a utopia as you thought, because that world in the story is based on our world, right? It's based on like kind of an idealized version of
like Earth,
like of our reality,
yeah.
Like the reality that we're sitting here talking to you, the audience.
Because it basically describes like modern Tokyo, but then with stuff like, and everyone gets along all the time, and no one suffers, and everyone's great. Like,
right. It's a very idealized version of what we would have today, and you could even see that like that book is based on the old world in the game, because when you're in like the Dragon Temple on the island, you're down there in an area called Shinjuku, and it's literally just, it's like the remnants of a fallen Shinjuku prefecture of Japan. Like it is our world, but what we see is that world has gone away because magic was introduced into that world, and everybody went to war over magic. So you realize that the book, the description of the utopia that you're following isn't really as much of a utopia as you thought it was. And I think that the end of the game kind of relates back to that theme of like, you've saved the day, you're the king, you won, but things still aren't where you want them to be. And so you actually like overhear people talking at one point in the end game where they're like talking about all the problems that still exist, and like you hear other people in the crowds be like, we want Luis back, like we're mad that Luis is dead, right?
Yeah.
So like there is still this sense of we need to do more, and you have created a like functioning government, right? You've created like governors in cities and stuff, right? Like your old friend, the governor guy whose name we will never remember in this whole thing. He's now become like a governor of his town, and like you've established local governments, and the idea that like not everything flows through the king. There's local governments, and you know they can kind of go up the chain to the king, and blah 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 blah. And you've created a system of government that is established enough that it can kind of run without the king anymore. So you actually leave with your party on another journey to a different land to see like how they run that land, so that you can learn from other people how to better your society. So like there is potential for a sequel, right? That's kind of what it feels like. Like, hey, sequel bait. But you kind of take off on this journey to foreign lands to better learn how to govern, to learn like what are other people doing so that I can be the best king that I can be. And that's kind of where the game leaves you off.
No, I do kind of like that style of ending, because it isn't necessarily just like, okay, we've beaten the Demon King thing and now all is right. Like I said, there is still work to do. This is ultimately going to be a new form of government to both the ruling class and the ruled, and everyone is going to be figuring this out as they go. And so I do think it's cool that you have your trusty council of advisors that are gonna go help you figure out how to do this the best, right? I don't necessarily hate that.
Yeah, it ends in a pretty satisfying way to me. I think, right, there are some steps, maybe some falling down the stairs a little bit, but I think it gets to a pretty good point at the end that I liked a lot of the themes and the way they all kind of come together. And some of it's a little muddy, but for the most part, I think the game gives you a lot to think about and a lot to chew on. Not stuff that we don't, I guess, already know, but like in our current turbulent political times and just a lot of the stuff that's kind of going on in real life, it was interesting to see some of that stuff reflected in this game and some of those themes kind of reflected here.
And there's a lot of things we haven't talked about yet. We haven't gotten too into like some of the main characters, right? And there's really too many to do a full dive into all of them. But
God, it'd be really tough.
Some of your close companions are really cool. Like I really liked Hulkenberg. She sort of has this like disgraced former knight thing going on because she was the night the prince got cursed, and she feels like it's her fault that it all went wrong and she couldn't protect him. And you really help her get like her confidence back over the course of the game. And then when it's revealed that you're the prince the whole time, she immediately like falls to her knees and like begging for forgiveness and stuff. And you just have to be like, look, like what have I talked to you about for the last 45 hours? Like, that you're better than this. This isn't your fault. And not only that, but you can still contribute to like our vision of the world. Like there's still work to be done, right? I feel like that could be one of the major themes of this game is it's constantly saying like, we're not giving up now, nor are we going to be complacent now, right? It's a constant striving toward improvement. And, she has a fun personality. She has like this addiction to food, and she like
she'll eat anything. Like literally anything.
There's always these scenes where everyone else is like, this is disgusting. What is this? And she's like, what are you talking about? Like, this is amazing. And she's like shoving it down her throat.
Like, thank you for the local delicacy. It's like some like weird, horrid squid monster.
Yufa is basically Yuna from Final Fantasy X. She is a summoner on a island of primitives who is spending her whole life to be sacrificed until some boy comes along without a name and tells her that she doesn't actually have to. Which, God,
I did not pull that together until you made that comparison to me, and now it's all I can see.
That's all I could think about the whole time I was on that island, especially because from the first second of this game, I just hated the fact that you named the character. I think that's so dumb. Especially because like he's not fully silent protagonist, which makes it, I think, particularly a bad decision to let you name him. But I'm just so tired of this, where we spend 80 hours with people dancing around saying your fucking name because they want you to be able to name him. And I don't understand that, right? In Final Fantasy X, it was awful because it was just boy and you. At least at some point, you're just the prince, so they just call you the prince. But until that point, it's just more boy and you and crap. Captain, maybe?
Like leader, some variation of like boss figure.
And I guess this is just like, this is what Persona does, right? And this is what SMT does, I assume. Yeah. So it's just them carrying on their tradition, and that's fine. Like maybe there's more people out there that would fucking riot if you couldn't name the character. I don't know. But I just find that like when you're going for something so narrative heavy and where the protagonist is supposed to be so important, let him have a personality. You know what I mean?
I think he does have a little bit of a personality. I think you're being a little bit harsh. I think he does have a little bit of a personality. A lot of it is a reflection of the party around you. And that is kind of a Persona tradition for sure. But he does have like just giving him a voice at all gives him a little bit of personality because you can tell like how he's responding to things through tone of voice. So I think he's gotten a little bit there. I think you're being a little harsh, but
I don't. But that's okay.
That's fair. I think another character worth talking about, or did you want to say more about Yufa?
No, go ahead.
I was going to say another character that I think is worth talking about is Haizme, the UG little bat rabbit creature that I keep referring to. He is probably, I kind of heard this in one of the analysis videos or, Game of the Year videos, whatever I was talking about, listening to. But they were talking about him being one of the best examples of like an older adult figure in a JRPG, and I really think that's accurate. Like Auron is probably another really good example from Final Fantasy X, but outside of him, like who?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's always just a bunch of people in their 20s and then like an alien or something.
Right, or some like weird pervy old man who's like, doing some weird pervy shit because Japan. But Haizme has this like really great story about his son dying and dealing with the grief of his lost son, and like his whole follower link or follower arc thing is about where to bury his son and like where he should finally let his remains rest, because he wants to find the ideal place, and he thinks it might be back at his village, but he goes there and they're just like very intolerant and very like just like not the people that he wants them to be and not the people that he wants his son to be with. Right. So it's just like a lot of like interesting stuff with his grief with his son, and it ends with him like putting the remains of his son in like a locket that he carries with him basically, and like going on a journey with him, and like it's just a really touching story, and he's got a lot of stuff that he's dealt with, and he's one of the better characters I think as well.
The a complaint I see a lot, which I think I like mostly agree with, is that the first three characters just seem to get so much more time that you're forced to deal with their stuff, like through the main plot, than the back half. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily true about Yufa, because you do have this, whole thing where you go to her island and you learn about the dragon and all that, right? But I think it's particularly true of Juna and Basilia. Is that how you say his name?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I spell it wrong every time, but I think I've pronounced it right.
I think it's Basilia, yeah.
Because Juna's just sort of like this songstress that's like Louis obsessed with until suddenly she's in your party. And then it just doesn't seem to, like, she spends so much time with you when she's supposed to be like Louis' little like doll that it almost makes no sense to me. He just like does not seem to care that she is spending so much time with you, even after he learns that like you're not necessarily like all on his side, right? But yeah, to go back to what you were saying.
Well, she was always faking that.
Yeah.
Like, okay, all right.
But I just feel like he doesn't seem to care that you spend like weeks with her after this, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably because he doesn't care about her that much.
And then neither does Del or Basilio. Like, they kind of do, but only up until the point where they'll do anything about it before just being on your side. So I think a lot of the stuff with the companions is a little rushed in the back half. But to get back to what you were saying, I do agree that Haizume's story is like really well done. And he's this just like older, wiser character that clearly has like the trauma of someone who is in their older age. And he's lost a child, and so much of his story is about how to deal with that. And it's kind of cliche, but never feels that way. Whereas I feel like Stroll's, like I liked Stroll, but for the most part, that is just a spoiled rich kid trying to become independent for 80 hours. And that's more or less like...
I think Stroll is carried a lot by his voice actor and just like the minute to minute writing on him. Like I think like his actual like performance and the things that are written directly for him help elevate him a little bit than his like actual story. Because I always felt like really attached to Stroll. I was like, man, I like Stroll.
Yeah.
But you're right. A lot of his story is pretty generic, but he is still a really good character to me. And I think that's due to the voice acting and the writing for him.
So this might be the first and only time I ever say this on this podcast, but the voice acting in this game enhanced so much of the characterization for me. And I think it's because they're very careful about when they do it. Like, they did not waste the resources on voicing like every line in this game. There's a lot of times where the person now, it reminds me of Skies of Arcadia, where so much of the character's emotion is in a facial feature. Although instead of it being on the actual character model, it's the little portraits next to their text at the bottom.
Yeah.
But those are always really detailed and change a lot. And I think it's a fantastic job. Particularly the main characters, I think like Stroll and Hulk and Haizume have such great voice acting that really brings out like a lot of the characterization and emotion. And even to the point where sometimes the lines aren't all that great and they're a little corny or cliche, their delivery is just great. I mean, there's so much personality to your companions, and I really appreciated that. And I think that even bleeds into a lot of the followers too.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think a lot of the characters are enhanced by their voice acting and the fact that you get to like spend so much time with them and dig into them, right? Like if you didn't have all the follower stories, like a lot of these characters would be really one note, kind of whatever, you're fine, but you can really dig into their story and get to know more about them. And those followers, they're not always voiced, but like certain important parts are voiced. So it's like you get to see the emotion when it matters. And yeah, I really liked a lot of the voice work in this game. And I'm a little more forgiving on voice work than you are, for sure. But I think a lot of it is really good. And a lot of it is really British, which I think helps. Yeah. British and fantasy just works.
It really does. Yeah.
It's just like, I think, a tried and true thing at this point. Like fantasy stories with British voice acting just tends to work better.
Look, man, when voice acting's good, it's good. And in this game, it's really good, I think. There's a lot of... So the way the game kind of works, right, is you sort of have three levels of the storytelling, right? You have the fully blown, fully voiced anime cutscenes, right? You have what are sort of almost like in-engine cutscenes with voice acting. And then you have like what is essentially just gameplay with dialogue and there's no voice acting, right? And I think they're very good about choosing when it's worth investing into these things for what part of the game. Like, the main plot is almost always that middle one with the occasional big cutscene. And then the side conversations, like your follower conversations, are almost always that last one where there's not a ton of voice except for like the big reveals at the end or like when you first meet them,
Right.
right? But a lot of it is just unvoiced. But it doesn't matter because it's like it's pretty interesting. They're typically pretty concise and short, and it's like what your activity is for that day. So if you spend a couple minutes on it, like it's okay. You go to a variety of locations, you deal with a variety of issues. I still love the fact that Bridget decided to be like a mega capitalist by making magic toys instead of weapons. Like there's just so many cool endings to that. And I really just feel like the character artwork and the facial features and the voice acting are all done when they need to be done. They're not overdone. They're not underdone. Really well executed. I think that the game really nails all of those aspects.
Yeah, so, something that is different from Persona that I think really helps Metaphor in that regard is taking the follower stories from 10 to 8. So in Persona, all the follower stories are 10, like,
Ranks.
days worth, right? This game drops it down to 8, and there's a couple times in Persona where you'll do what looks like a follower conversation and you think you're going to progress, but you don't actually progress. Oh, so you get like a relatively generic, like, we spent the day hanging out. And then the next time you can progress it. And I think those are big frustrations that people have with Persona. That Metaphor is condensed and tightened and said, no, if you're going to talk to this person, if they're available to talk to you, then you will progress that story. You will get to the next thing. And we're only going to have 8 of them instead of 10. And those two decisions are huge to make that feel a lot more streamlined throughout.
Another thing I think I read, correct me if I'm wrong, is that in Persona, the questions you could answer could actually influence like how much you built toward that character. Where in this, it's like, it doesn't really matter what you answer. You'll get more essentially like magic experience if you do the quote right conversation, but you always still progress the conversation rank, the follower rank.
Yes. Yep. Another huge benefit to this. And it really, to me, it helps that all the characters, I would say pretty much all of them are interesting to talk to. Like, I enjoyed the follower conversations, even the ones who aren't your party, but especially your party, I think, has really strong, like, stories to follow. Even, like, I think probably the weakest, again, kind of like we talked about, like, Basilio kind of has a weaker one. I could hardly remember Juna's. I know she's, like, with, like, a rival songstress or something. Juna and Basilio definitely take the biggest hits party-wise.
Yeah, I think that's true.
But I still liked both of those characters. And again, I think a lot of that has to do with voice acting and just, like, their actual dialogue writing.
Part of it feels like they were like, man, we've really made every character a little too hybrid. What if we make one that's nothing but magic stats and one that's nothing but physical stats to round out your party here? Because I think both of them easily have the highest, like, inherent, like, base stats of those two things. But yeah, man, I would agree with that. Even when I was like toward the end, it was really more of like, I think I was just like, the game was a little too long for me and I was starting to get burned out more so than I thought any particular character was like uninteresting when I started skipping some of those follower things. Because they really are pretty well done. And a lot of them, like, man, I'm not gonna lie. Like, there were several conversations I had with Maria where I'm like, where's the tissues? Like, I'm crying here. Same with like Bridget and the kids at the end. Like, there's definitely some of those where I was like, it may not be like, the highest level writing you've ever seen, but it's certainly competent. And I think even beyond competent. And it absolutely does what it needs to do like 90% of the time.
Yeah, I think if we're defining, right, like this game won Best Narrative at the Game Awards. And I think if we're just defining narrative as the main plot from beginning to end, I can see where people would maybe have some discrepancies on that and where like, maybe the main plot falters at times. But I think if you just take narrative as like the world, the characters, the story, and how it all ties together, like the characters drive a lot of this game. And having them be so relatable and interesting and compelling is a big factor in why I think this game's got so much praise narratively.
Yeah, and I've been critical of a few things here and there, some quite intensely, but but overall, I think the total package of this game is just still so successful, right? And I think I would be crazy to say otherwise, putting 80-something hours into it. It's definitely not a situation where like, it's like every few months, whenever Game of Thrones comes up, my fiance will say something like, should we watch that together? Because she's never seen it. And I'm like, no, we shouldn't. And we never will. Because truly the end of that absolutely fucking ruined the rest of it. Like, I don't think I could enjoy watching the rest of it. I don't think that's the case for this game. Like, I was a little sour on the ending, both mechanically and otherwise. But like, it was such a blast most of the game, right? And there's just so much good stuff here, and I think them branching out of the sort of confined setting of like the modern high school thing with Persona was a really good idea, and I would love to see them build on it. And I think some of the stuff they've done mechanically too is just so much fun. Like I normally do not enjoy grinding in the end game. I only stopped because it became apparent I wasn't actually going to be able to unlock all the royals. But I did so much grinding in that last 30-day period. And I didn't even like hate it. Because I think something we didn't bring up yet is the whole overworld combat thing. Once you out-level an enemy substantially, when you hit it, it just dies. And you get experience from it and money, right? So you don't actually have to fight it.
Such a brilliant choice.
It's really good. Earthbound on SNES did something like that, and I've just been waiting 3 decades to see it again. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. I think a lot of what makes Metaphor so good is taking a lot of the things that people love about Persona and other Atlus RPGs and kind of putting a new layer on it, a new world, a new kind of even theme and idea, and running with it and taking all the complaints that people have about those games and streamlining a lot of that stuff down. From mechanics, the overworld combat, an improvement on Persona. The followers, right? I think almost everybody universally would say it's an improvement on the way Persona handles it.
Yeah.
And by doing that, they've kind of created a whole new franchise that they can build out and take a lot of these lessons they learned from Metaphor, hopefully, and apply back to the mainline Persona games, which I'm sure will still follow the same like high school trend, right? I'm sure they're going to follow the modern world kind of kids in high school thing. And maybe story-wise that won't work for people, but hopefully mechanically they can learn lessons from Metaphor and apply that back to that while continuing the Metaphor line of things, maybe the more high fantasy stuff, or maybe they even like branch into something sci-fi or whatever, right? Do other things separate of that. And I think that will continue to propel Atlus in the RPG world as they've been the last couple of years, kind of standing next to Square on the JRPG ladder.
There is a game from Obsidian called Tyranny. And one of my favorite things about it is that the first hour of the game is you basically making a bunch of decisions that like a sort of a conquering warlord makes, and that sets the stage for how the world actually plays out as you play the actual game. And I would absolutely love something like that in a sequel to this, where you kind of can it's almost like in games where you pick one path or the other and it kind of divides the game in half and you sort of need to do more than one playthrough. It'd be really cool to have a setup where like you're making a bunch of choices as the new king, and this ultimately sets the stage for where the world goes that you play in. And that could add a bunch of replayability. That could add a whole bunch of variety to things, right? Because ultimately this game is still pretty linear, and I don't think that's necessarily
for sure.
I don't think that's like a downside, right? I'm not saying the game should become like the super open-ended narrative, but maybe having more narrative reason to play through it again could be interesting.
Yeah, you saying that makes me really want that, and I'm worried they probably won't do that. So you're getting my hopes up for nothing, Adam. How dare you?
If only I could be a director that has never directed a game before and just get to take over a multi-million-dollar franchise.
Yeah, if only.
One of the last things we should probably touch on, just because it's kind of a cornerstone of the like franchises of this company, is they have these really artful approaches to like the interface and the menu design and all of these things. I think at first I found it a bit of a headache. I mean, there's like 8 different fonts on the menu screen and they're all equally hard to read, but you really do, I think, get used to all these things pretty quickly. I mean, I would have never played for 80 hours if I couldn't, right? So maybe it's a little hit or miss for me, but it does seem to be something that a lot of people really like about this franchise. And I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I definitely like the menus. I think they fit more of the fantasy vibe, right? Like, again, doing the thing that I said I wouldn't do, but ended up doing anyway. I think Persona 5 is the peak of this for me personally. I've never seen as much style come out of a game as I have Persona 5. I know it doesn't work for everybody necessarily, but for me, like the menus and the colors and the way it all like kind of comes together in Persona 5 is one of the best aesthetic choices I've seen in a UI. And I don't think Metaphor nails it quite as well as P5 does, but that there's just it feels like the spirit of like fantasy, right? Like all the menus feel like they're fantastical, and they're like, there's like weird patterns on the backgrounds, and the fonts are different, and there's like squiggly lines and shit to just not make it feel like a boring, like, oh, we're just scrolling down the menu and it's white text on a blue background, like old Final Fantasy games, whatever, right? Like it tries to give it some style. I know you had some complaints about the like in combat UI design with every action being mapped to a button instead of a menu, but for me, I think that makes it feel a little more dynamic, a little more like an action game in quotes, right? Like you're clicking a button that corresponds to an action, and that feels more like modern game design to me, and I liked that more than like scrolling through menus the whole time.
The system in itself is fine. The cancel button should not be mapped to the most useless action in the game. That is... I 100 fucking times I restarted a battle because I fucking guarded on accident, right? Like, because it would be, I would hit like ability, and then I realized, no, wait, I want to use a synthesis. So I hit B to back out. I don't know if I like accidentally hit it twice, or the game registers it twice, or my controller is broken, but I would just guard, and I would waste a whole turn guarding, and I would get so mad because, again, if you don't win in that first turn, it feels like crap. So like I would just restart it.
I think you're just impatient, Adam.
Bro. All they have to do is not map cancel to a fucking ability. That's all they have to do. Put it on the arrow pad. Put it on one of the buttons that weren't used. Literally, like, I think that is just the dumbest decision. That overall, like, because the overall system, you're right. It is more efficient. It's less button presses. It allows you to have a more stylized, like, halo that envelops the character with all the different actions. Like, it's cool. It's cool. B just needs to not do anything. I think that would instantly improve it.
Fair enough.
You say I'm impatient. Every ability in this fucking game has the most drawn out animation. Like, especially the synthesis. Holy cow. Like,
yeah, we didn't really talk about synthesis a ton.
They're just special abilities that use two people's turns.
But they're like really powerful, but they use typically more MP and more turn pips. So you have to methodically choose when to use them. It's an element that I really liked. It feels like it expands upon ideas that Atlus like played with before, but never quite did as efficiently as they do here.
It does feed into a lot of the systems, and I really like that because, like you said, it's really powerful, but it uses a bunch of mana. We've talked about how important that is to conserve throughout a dungeon. It is really powerful, but it uses 2 turn pips, which we've talked about how important it is to hit those weaknesses. And you can hit a weakness with the synthesis, and then you'll have 2 half-turn pips, so that was like a pretty cool move. You have the almighty damage, which nothing is weak against, but nothing strong against. That was a big strategy of mine toward the end. That worked perfectly until it didn't. And then...
Luis, how dare you?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple things I'd be remiss not to mention that I put like all of my stats in luck. Which was a really fun
you're
build.
A psychopath.
Well, oh God, you know what else we didn't mention? How much missing sucks in this game. And I know I deserve it on my main character because of the luck, but he was not the only one who was missing. And it's weird, right? Because it was like if you miss, it wastes 2 turn pips. But then if it's like if it gets repelled or blocked, it's like 4.
But I mean that's part of the strategy, right? It's like you don't want to get repelled and blocked.
It is sort of part of the strategy, but then they give you the instant reset button, so you can just rewind time and not do that.
I think it's a good decision overall because you probably would have quit this game if you didn't have that.
Well, my thought would be, why not just make it a regular fucking penalty for missing, which is that your attack does nothing. That way I wouldn't feel compelled to reset. Like, I think having the penalties for missing and repelling be so harsh, but then having the ability to just reset the fight, to me, like, one of these 2 things shouldn't exist. And that would have been a better design, but I don't know. That's just me.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I think missing particularly is bad. It never bothered me that much because, I mean, you just rally. Like, it's okay.
No, but it's not okay. Because you're not going to beat him in the first turn if you miss, and then you're going to get less than the full optimal amount of experience, and then the whole battle just doesn't feel as good as if you had not done that.
That's okay.
So then you can just hit the reset button, because the game is constantly telling you that if you didn't do it perfect, just start over.
This is just like Tactical Breach Wizards all over again.
Do not dare put these 2 games in the same fucking sentence, Austin.
This is just Tactical Breach Wizards. You're just retrying constantly until you get the optimal thing. It's fine.
But those were at least like secondary objectives. You know, that wasn't like this to me.
I'm right. It's fine.
This to me was just every second I wasn't doing it just felt like a second I was gonna have to grind in the end game. So you know, it's like
I think we'd also be remiss to not quickly mention that the royal archetypes that you can get at the end, which are supposed to be like the ultimate archetypes for each character, they don't give you any indication of what you're supposed to like go down to get those. So that was pretty frustrating for me. And I managed to get all of them, and I maxed it all out and got all the royals. But it didn't feel good in the end game to just constantly grind out classes that I never put on somebody and never would have thought to put on somebody, because I was just like, why would I do that? I already have this person with that archetype. And that was kind of frustrating. I wish they would have given more indication. And they kind of do by your stats, right? Like, you're supposed to be kind of following the best stat and the classes that would best match that stat, but it's just not enough. And so at the end of the game, I was like putting in, 10 hours of grinding to go down clash trees that I hadn't even explored with characters yet.
I think my problem with it the most is not even so much that, like, because like you said, if you know that you're going to have this super secret class at the end that uses certain things, you would probably assume that like the class each character starts off as is going to be an important part of that, right? But the thing is, if you haven't played Persona before, it's literally not until the Prince reveal 2/3 through the game that you know that the concept of royal classes are even a thing, right?
That's not a Persona thing either. So like they do have ultimate class, but there's no clash tree in Persona. So
Gotcha.
there's no like direct comparison. So I didn't know they existed until the Prince.
Yeah, so it wasn't so much that it was like, oh, if I had to guess which classes would be for Heismei's Royal, well, obviously I know it'd probably be Thief, right? But that wasn't the thing. The thing was when I got Heismei, I really needed a ranged physical class, and he had high agility, so I was like, I'll make him my sniper. Okay, this didn't seem like a bad decision in the moment because I didn't think for a second that like he would need to have all the way down the thief branch for me to get his ultimate class. And by the time that is revealed to you, it's just like way too late to start.
To be fair, he also does need all the gunner tree, or at least like most of it. So that wasn't the worst pick. But
yeah, the point remains the same though, is that like if I had known about these royal classes, I wouldn't have made Stroll my mage for most of the game. I wouldn't have made...
Stroll was my cleric like 90% of the game, and that had absolutely nothing to do with what I should have been doing with him.
And so I think if they're... That was just what I felt was a little cheap in that regard. It's not so much that like the classes they chose for the royals didn't make sense. It was more about just like not realizing that you shouldn't experiment that much in the early game, actually. You should leave them exactly as they come to you and max that out before you start experimenting.
Which feels antithetical to what this game wants you to do with the archetype system, so It's a little weird. I definitely think they can make some improvements to that in the future, however that might be. But yeah, it was just something that was kind of annoying by the end game, for sure.
And it's not a huge issue because I think the game is still mostly doable without it. Even like the final battle, like I'm never going to do it again. But even after I lost, I remember laying in bed like, oh, I bet I could beat this because I know exactly what I would do this time around, right? I'm just not going to spend 3 more hours doing it. But the point being, you don't need all the royals to beat Louis. Like you can very much do it without.
You don't. You do get a cool synthesis ability if you do get them all. It's called Armageddon's End or something like that. And it just is like an instant 9,999 damage attack.
Yeah. Which isn't actually the damage cap, it would turn out. I think I got like 13,000 as my highest.
See, most people don't put all their points into luck to do crazy crits with their
they really missed out. So
yeah, apparently. Some people actually beat the game though, so who knows.
Look, you had to fight him how many times? I'm just not going to fight him that many times. I'm sorry.
I did end up having to fight him like 3 or 4 times. It was terrible.
Would actually rather die. But that's okay.
I also didn't take 3 hours for the first phase.
I did have a pretty it wasn't 3 hours for the first phase. It was for all of them. But I did have a very like slower paced build, to say the least.
You had like a turtle strategy going on, but
yeah, which was perfect until the last fucking 20% of his third phase. That still makes me bad. But like, I wish there had been more stuff throughout that fight that made me realize it wasn't going to work until that far into it. But it's fine.
It's fine. It's fine. It's overall, I think Metaphor is an interesting game coming from Atlus, who's been very like, at least an interesting Persona style game, because they've always been very like high school, blah blah blah. Like a lot of the themes are kind of the same, right? Persona's always dealt with similar themes, not so much like self-governance and unity through diversity, but the same type of themes of like, fighting against the oppression and like, going against oppressive powers and authority and independence and all these things. So it takes kind of some of those themes and brings them to a more fantastical setting that can do like more real world politics and things. And I really like what they ended up doing with this game. It's still in my top 5, probably my second favorite game of the year last year. So yeah, I was really pleased with it.
So I think overall, would you agree with the statement that like, if you enjoyed Atlus's previous games, you would probably like this one? Because I've only played Persona 5 and even then only maybe like half of it. But it very much feels like it scratches a lot of the same itches and it's just sort of like a new twist, a new take on that setting.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think if you are a fan of the Persona style game, especially, this will definitely work for you. And if the thing that is keeping you from Persona is kind of its setting and its characters and like the high school of it all, I think this is a great way to get that same feel of Persona and what makes those games so fun and interesting with a setting that's maybe more relatable to you, which I imagine is what your experience was with this.
Yeah, more or less. And I think too, the game from what I've read and from what you've talked about, just gets rid of some of those pain points from the systems in Persona. And I really,
definitely.
And I just personally felt that the time in this, like the calendar, was like an appropriate amount of pressure, right? I never felt like I was never going to be able to do all the things I wanted, but nor did I feel like I had unlimited time to do all the things I wanted. I felt like it was pretty good at driving the game forward, even though like I'm sure I could find like 20 hours to get out of this game. It overall feels like reasonably well paced, and it doesn't, I other than like my complaints with the end, I just never really felt like this game was wasting my time whole scale. For how long you spend in it, it does feel like a fairly decent duration, right?
Yes, I would 100% agree with all of what was said there.
So yeah, to wrap this up, I think my final recommendation on this is definitely play it if you're a fan of JRPGs and Atlus. And I think even if you're not, maybe it's still full price, so maybe that's steep if you're not a fan of these types of games, but it's definitely worth checking out because I think it's one of the few JRPGs that seems to have try to iterate on that more traditional JRPG system rather than just becoming like a full-blown action game. And I think that in of itself is something I really enjoyed. Like I never realized that I could have fun in that kind of turn-based system and managing mana and keeping track of all my equipment and my stats like in that old school JRPG system. I think it does a great job at that. I think the narrative is interesting enough to keep it going. I think most of the combat and the equipment, all this stuff really synergizes well, and all the classes and the skills. Like it's just, regardless of why you play RPGs, I think you'll find something in this game to enjoy.
Yeah, something that Atlus has always been really good at, I think, is taking all of its disparate parts of its games and kind of bringing them all together and making them all work together. So everything you do, every action you take, whether it's building up your virtues or your followers or grinding out a dungeon in one day or whatever it is that you're doing, every activity you make is all kind of going towards the same goal and driving towards the same thing, and it's all working together. It's all like you said, synergizing really well. And I think this is a great example of that. I think it takes a lot of the best parts of Persona and streamlines them. And I think while I personally will probably prefer Persona 5 still over this, because I prefer that kind of high school anime style, like that's something that I liked a lot. This is a great example of a Persona style Atlus game that doesn't follow those tropes and does something different and new. And I would highly recommend.
I read a review where someone said that this game feels like less than the sum of its parts, and I just don't know if I can agree with that, especially because there was a couple of those parts I really didn't like. And yet, as a whole, I did enjoy this game. And I do feel like as a total package, for everything that you dislike, you'll find 3 things you do. And I think ultimately that did it for me. You know, I can complain about this, I complain about that, but the full 80-hour experience was one that I don't regret. And that's like, I think all that really needs to be said about a game this long. Well, that about wraps up our thoughts on Atlus's latest narrative JRPG, Metaphor ReFantazio.
You can find this episode, as well as all of our previous episodes, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcasting platform. And you can also find us on various social media at the Games Gone By podcast.
Signing off for Games Gone By, I'm Adam.
I'm Austin.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time.